All right, buckle up for a deep dive, folks. Today we're taking a look at a story you might not know, but one that asks some big questions about crime and punishment here in America. We're going to be talking about Anthony Wimberly, a man whose life took a real dark turn, leading to some really awful crimes.
What's so fascinating about Wimberly's case is that it's not your typical true crime story. It
Yeah.
really forces us to look at those tricky connections between the choices we make as people and the way society shapes us, and how those things can lead to both violence and the possibility of, well, turning things around. So
Yeah.
we're going to be using a whole bunch of sources here, like biographical info, court records, even some old newspaper articles, trying to piece together his life bit by bit.
Yeah, and we're going to try and trace Wimberly's path, starting from a really tough beginning all the way to those horrible events that happened later and really focusing on those moments where things could have gone differently. You know what I mean? Those what ifs that always seem to hang around in these kinds of cases.
Exactly. And we're also going to take a close look at how the legal system dealt with his actions. Thinking about the way sentencing worked back then and how we might see it differently today. So, are you ready to jump in?
Oh, I am absolutely ready. Let's do it. So, Anthony Rene Wimberly, born Anthony Rene Lee on October 26, 1962, in Antioch, California. Right from the start, his life was just, well, unstable. His parents split up when he was just a baby, and his mom, she was trying to make ends meet. Moved
Yep.
him around a lot before finally settling in Oakland.
Right. Now you might be thinking, okay, tough childhood. We hear that a lot in these cases. But it's important to remember that those aren't just ideas. They have a real impact on the kid's developing brain. Think about it. A child needs stability, needs to feel safe and secure to develop, healthy emotions, how to control their impulses, even just being able to trust people when those basic things are missing. Well, the effects can be pretty serious and they can last a lifetime.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with Wimberly, we see all that early instability show up in some pretty troubling ways. At only 14 years old, he's arrested for assault and sent to a group home up in Orville. I mean, that's young to be getting into trouble with the law.
Sadly, it's true. Getting in trouble with the law early on often means more trouble down the road. That's where those early intervention programs can really make a difference. It's not just about punishing a young offender, but getting to the root of why they're doing these things.
Mhm.
Providing counseling, education, those support systems that can help break that cycle.
It's kind of like when you break a bone,
Yeah.
right? You can't just ignore it and hope it fixes itself. You got to set it right and give it what it needs to heal properly.
That's a great way to put it. And in Wimberly's case, it seems like those chances to help him, to intervene, they were missed. Or maybe not fully taken advantage of.
Yeah.
And his crimes, they just escalated fast. I mean, he went from assault to robbery, which landed him in a California Youth Authority facility, basically juvie. And then after that, a whole bunch of parole violations.
Yeah, and even though he tried to get back on track, went to Castlemont High School for a while, even registered for adult day school, it seems like it never really stuck.
It's like he was caught in some kind of current and couldn't get out, even if he wanted a different life, all that stuff from his past,
Mm.
and not having real support. Man, that must have made it so hard to break free.
And then there's this incident back in 1981 that, looking back, feels like a really bad sign. Wimberly breaks into a home, ties up a 12-year-old boy, and finds a shotgun. It's scary to think about, especially knowing what happened later.
Right, that incident, it's not just some random act. It shows a clear escalation in his crimes. He's not acting out of impulse anymore. There's planning there, a willingness to use force and intimidation. That's a huge red flag that nobody seemed to see.
Yeah, it's like they say, the past is prologue. That 1981 thing, it really does feel like a glimpse of what was coming. And sadly, it wasn't long after, just a few years, that things took a really dark turn.
That's right. Fast forward to 1984, Wimberly's out on parole again. And this time, things go very, very wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, it really makes you think about how the justice system, for all it tries to do, doesn't always help people change.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and it's tough to say this, but sometimes it feels like the system itself makes it harder for people to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, and for Wimberly, this parole leads to a terrible, terrible crime spree.
Hmm.
In November 1984, he commits a truly awful act. The rape and shooting of a 12-year-old girl. I mean, it's the kind of thing that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about people.
Right. This is a really frightening jump in the level of violence. It's not about robbery or even assault anymore. It's a brutal act that shows a complete lack of respect for human life and a scary level of, well, of not caring about the pain he's causing. And what's really troubling is that this change, this shift, happened so soon after he got out of prison. Studies actually show that right after someone is released, that's when they're most likely to commit another crime. Not having support, struggling to fit back into society, the stigma, all of that can make someone feel hopeless, desperate, and that can push them back towards crime.
It makes you wonder, are there any signs, anything that could tell us who is more likely to be violent again? I mean, can we even predict something like that?
Well, that is the big question, isn't it? It's the question everyone in criminology wants to answer. And while we can't be totally sure, there are things that can increase the chances of violence. Drugs, mental health problems that aren't treated, impulsive behavior, not having a stable place to live or a job. Those are all red flags. But even knowing all that, predicting what someone will do, it's incredibly complicated.
And for Wimberly's victims, those complexities led to terrible suffering. Just a month later, December 1984, he strikes again, this time breaking into the home of 24-year-old Anna Aravalo.
And this crime, just like the one before, is filled with brutality. Wimberly raped Aravalo and shot her several times. He ended up hiding her body in a closet. And you know what makes this case even more heartbreaking? Aravalo was a mother. She had twin baby daughters. They were left unharmed, but alone in the next room. Just imagine the terror those little babies must have felt, completely helpless to do anything.
It's just awful. It really shows how far-reaching these crimes are. It's not just the victims themselves who suffer, it's their families, everyone who loved them, the whole community feels it. The trauma, it spreads like ripples, leaving scars that can last for generations.
That's exactly right. These types of crimes, they destroy the feeling of safety that a community needs. Fear takes hold, and people start to question everything. Can they trust their neighbors? Is their home really a safe place? The impact of something like this, it can be huge and last a very, very long time.
And sadly, the violence didn't stop there. In January 1985, Wimberly goes into a beauty parlor in West Oakland, demands money from the two employees, Vicky Russo and Marilyn Moore. They tell him they don't have any cash, and he shoots them. Both. Multiple times. Marilyn Moore, she dies. Vicky Russo is left with very serious injuries.
This crime feels like it was driven by a mix of desperation and a real coldness. Wimberly was clearly on edge, ready to use extreme violence even for just a little bit of money. It's a stark reminder of how dangerous untreated mental health problems can be and how much we need mental health services, accessible and effective ones, within the justice system.
So after shooting them at the beauty parlor, Wimberly takes Russo's van and leads the police on a high-speed chase through the streets of Oakland. Can you imagine the chaos, the fear that must have gripped the city as news of this spread? I mean, newspaper reports from back then, they described the police helicopter, spotlights searching through the dark streets trying to find him.
Yeah, it must have felt like a movie, except it was real life. For the people involved, this was real. And I think it's important to remember, behind the headlines, behind the police reports and all that, there are real people whose lives were forever changed by what Wimberly did.
And then, even when it seemed like it couldn't get any worse, Wimberly does something else. On January 31st, 1985, he breaks into the home of 62-year-old Doris Wan Lee and kills her during a burglary.
This last murder, it really sticks out. Unlike the others, which maybe were driven by needing money or wanting power, this one feels more impulsive, random. Makes you wonder, was Wimberly becoming more and more reckless? Less worried about what might happen because of what he was doing.
Yeah, it's a terrifying thought, just a random act of violence. Like, it could happen to anyone, anywhere. It makes you feel vulnerable, Like, Wimberly he took that feeling of safety away from everyone.
I agree. It's that unpredictability that makes this whole case so unsettling. But the good news is, his reign of terror did end. On February 5th, 1985, he was arrested.
Oh, okay. Do we know what finally led to that? I mean, was it a specific piece of evidence? Maybe someone saw something, or was it just, the sheer number of crimes he'd committed?
It's interesting. The sources we have, they don't really go into detail about how he was caught. What we do know is that he ended up being charged with 16 felonies on top of the murders.
Wow, 16. That's a lot. Seems like they were really going after him, huh?
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? And that's something they often do in these kinds of cases. By bringing a bunch of charges, it makes it more likely that they'll get a conviction. Even if some of the charges don't stick, others probably will, which means he'll definitely get a long sentence. It's like, in a way, it reflects how serious these crimes are, the need to make sure that someone who did these things is held responsible.
And for Wimberly, it definitely meant serious consequences. 3 life sentences, no parole. Do you think that kind of sentence, does it fit with how people thought about justice back then?
I think it does, yeah. Back in the 80s, the focus was on punishment, keeping dangerous people off the streets. The idea of rehabilitation, it was there, but it wasn't the main thing. 3 life sentences without parole. That's a strong message. It says, this person is dangerous, and they will never be free again.
So, where does that leave us? We've gone from a troubled childhood to crimes that just kept getting worse to these brutal murders that terrified a whole community. How do we even start to understand something like this?
That's the question, isn't it? I think Wimberly's case reminds us that people are complicated. Rehabilitation is hard, and finding justice when faced with senseless violence, well, that's something we're always striving for. It makes us think about responsibility, about how systems fail, and about whether someone can ever really redeem themselves, even after doing terrible things.
So, I mean, is there anything we can learn from this? Any clear lessons? Or are we just left with more questions?
I think it's both, honestly. Wimberly's story shows us how important it is to have programs that get to the root of why people commit crimes early on. It shows how important mental health services are, both inside and outside the justice system. And it makes us think about how we approach sentencing and rehabilitation. Do we focus on punishing people? Or do we try to give them a real chance to change, to become part of society again? These are big questions, and the answers will shape how we handle criminal justice in the future.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that Anthony Wimberly's story, it's more than just another true crime story, right? It reflects bigger issues, problems that we're all dealing with as a society. And before we go, one last thought. Something we came across that was pretty intriguing. Wimberly's sudden turn towards extreme violence after he got out on parole, it was compared to another murderer, a guy named Raymond George. They were both released around the same time, but their paths were very different. So what could cause that? What could make two people with similar backgrounds end up so differently? That's something to think about as you keep learning about the criminal justice system and, well, about what it means to be human.